All right, so we're going to look at Western European Middle Ages today, and then we're going to get to the Eastern European Middle Ages today. All of this is part of 1.6, the rise, if you will, developments in Europe between 1200 and 1450. Okay, so when I think of the Middle Ages, for today, I'm just going to use around the fall of Rome, which is Western European and the Western Roman Empire, and eventually what will be the fall of Constantinople. All of this is going to be a lesson about what Europe might have looked like before the New World was, if you will, explored. So Europe at the end of the Middle Ages looks a lot like the Europe we can imagine today. Scotland and Ireland, and eventually Castile and Aragon will form together to be our Spain, France. You will notice the Byzantine over there to the right. Italy, you're not going to see an Italy of today. That and Germany are actually founded in the 1800s. All right. Now, to get to here, we need to backtrack to here. So this is around 600 CE, centuries after the fall of Rome, where Germanic tribes, Germanic powers, sometimes called barbarians, have taken over large expanses of land. They are creating pre-modern societies, but largely they live very regionally. Now, you still see that the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire is still strong. It still dominates the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Now, sometimes we refer to this as the Dark Ages, and I guess I just want to give a shout out on why. Looking at the graph, you see the city of Rome around 100 CE, and then the city of Rome around 900 CE. And one way we can refer to this as the Dark Ages is because people have gone backwards in time in terms of what we think of a society or a civilization. Societies and civilizations tend to have a huge quantity of urbanization, but if the cities are not beneficial, if anything, they might be hazardous, you leave the cities. And now you're going to see the fall of major empires. So here are some of the qualities here. Compared to the greatness of Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the Dark Ages, maybe 600, 900 CE, are definitely different looking. There's a decrease in urbanization, a decrease in regional and international trade. There's a decrease in centralized governments or empires spouting with one voice. There's going to be a decrease in scholasticism, less learning, less reading and writing. The only way to become a learned individual at this point was through the church, through the monasteries. There's a decrease in Latin. The common written language of Rome is falling apart while people start speaking and writing in their more regional tongue and dialect. So if you want to, you can go watch Crash Course number 14. What John Green does in this crash course is talks about how strong during that 1200 to 1450 time period, where how strong China and the Middle East were with, Baghdad and the Song China. And that's the contrast with what we consider the Dark Ages of Western Europe. But it wasn't dark around the world, is really where I think John's going. I refer to him as John, we're tight. So what I'm going to do now is do a little tour of Europe. So we see the rise of the Franks. So at one time, the Gaul region will fall to the Franks, which are going to be a Germanic tribe that invade. In 511, a Frank by the name of Clovis will unite a fair amount of land under his rule, and I want to add this, will make it a Christian land. So we sometimes like to say that the barbarians were pagan or just non-believers of Christianity. What Clovis is doing is creating a kind of like an apparatus, a hierarchy, a system to which a nation can be formed. Now, 732, I made mention this already in class. Down in Spain, we have Al-Andalus and the Umayyad. We have the Islamic world, Dar al-Islam, expanding northward. And at the Battle of Tours, we see Charles the Hammer Martel, a descendant of Clovis, stop Muslim expansion and save Christendom. In around 800, we have Charles the Great emerge. Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, unites all of France and even is appointed by the Pope the Holy Roman Emperor. So now he kind of gets that accolade, that high five, that not only are you an emperor of the Franks, but I, as the Catholic voice, respect you as a Catholic king. So Charlemagne, shown here in the map and shown here in the Song of Roland, is an anomaly for the time period, a Western European monarch that expands and centralizes. That's a rarity for the time period. So from the Song of Roland, and now there comes the archbishop. He spurs his horse, goes up into the mountains, summons the French, and he preached them a sermon. Barons, my lords, Charlemagne left us in this place. We know our duty to die like good men for our king, fight, defend the holy Christian faith. So you can see political and religious leadership merging together. You could even see on that map that Charlemagne conquered all the way deep towards Russia by his lifetime. Things will fall apart quickly with his children. So one thing that he did do is he spread education. He traveled the kingdom. He promoted Frankish royal agents to these different regions to help unify and kind of be the mouthpiece of Charlemagne. All of this is very indicative of an empire. It's just a short-lived one. Now, what you will see in most regions of Western Europe is something called feudalism. Feudalism is where there is a hierarchy, but it's not a bureaucracy at all. It's like a relationship where the king owns the land, but he doesn't rule the land. There's no way for him to go around everywhere and tell them, this is the law you need to do, and I'm going to enforce it. So what the king would do is give land to both the church and the nobility. And then they would have to pledge allegiance. And then the nobility would then give out some of their land to others. So it would trickle down to more and more people owing them allegiance. Eventually, the peasants would not own land, would not be given land to own. They'd just be given land to work. And they would owe their lord, military service, a tax in form of either money or food. So the king and the hierarchy of the nobility wouldn't actually have to grow the food or do the work. That would be the low-level peasants. Now, there's some terminology on this slide. The lord is the person in charge, the vassal's the follower. So the king is the lord, the noble is the vassal. But you can be a noble and have vassals under you. In the middle of the page, you see the knights. Knights were hired mercenaries. They were hired by the king, the nobility, the church to protect their money and their wealth. So I don't want you thinking that knights were all honorable. They served their noble with honor, but they weren't honorable human being doing the right thing. Fiefs are the plots of land given out. Serfs is just another name we use for peasants. Thus, we often refer to peasants in feudalism as serfdom. Now I love this visual because it shows order, but it's just chaos being organized. Because nobles fought other nobles. Nobles competed with the church for land. Knights of one noble would fight knights of another noble. So that's not really a country or a state. There's no bureaucracy where you take the Confucian civil service exams and you represent the country. All right? This is a good one. So in terms of this feudal society, this is something about the patriarchy that was there, the peers plowmen. What by spinning they save, they spend it in house hire, both in milk and in meal, to make a mess of porridge, to cheer up their children, to chafe for their food, and they themselves suffer surely much hunger and woe in the winter, with waking at nights and rising a rock at oft restless cradle. This is actually kind of showing the story of women in this patriarchal society of Western Europe. It doesn't sound like the Chinese foot binding, but it still shows the role of women in feudal Europe. Some technologies, all right? There was major writing such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Universities were slowly being formed, usually starting off as monasteries. People were speaking their local language, horse collar and stirrups. But the other thing I want to bring up is the three-field system. This is where you would have 3 plots of land where you would plant something that destroys the nutrients like wheat. The next season, you would plant beans, which are gentler on the nutrients. And then the next season, you would just literally till it up and let it sit fallow. So you would have one field go through those 3 stages. So in a 3-field system, you would have 3 different plots of land at different stages in the 3-field system. Now, to you and I, we're like, this is boring. But stop. Think of the chinapas of the Aztecs. Think of the terrace farming of the Inca. Now, think of the 3-field system of the Europeans. How can they feed themselves with the land that they live on without overusing the nutrients? You could only till land so much until you've used it up. Now, we've done feudalism, we've done the Franks. Let's go to England. So the Romans at one time controlled England all the way up to Hadrian's Wall. Eventually, the English will be settled by invaders such as the Angles and the Saxons. The Angles and the Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, will help define about a couple hundred years of English rule. And then the Normans will invade, who are from northern France, Normandy, for those who remember D-Day. So William the Conqueror invades in 1066, thus creating a whole new hierarchy of rule in England. He centralizes the government. An example of that is the Doomsday Book, where he takes account of all of the wealth of England, which in itself, by doing that, is kind of like a census, well before the United States was having their census every 10 years. A couple hundred years later, the kings, such as William the Conqueror and others, the kings will be put in check by something called the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta was an attempt by nobles to get the king to not have total absolute power. And actually, years after the Magna Carta, you'll see the emergence of what you have heard of as Parliament. King John was taken to a field, put a sword to his head, and basically said, "You must sign this. You must abdicate some of your authority to the lords. You are not an absolute monarch." And then what we're going to see for years is there's going to be contests within England and also across the English Channel with France, such as the 100 Years' War. England is a little bit stronger during the Black Death because of its distance from the mainland, but they will also engage with the Crusades. Here's an excerpt of the Magna Carta. It's nothing attractive. What you see in that excerpt, you might want to hit pause, is just talking about taxation without the king being able to tax when, whom, and wherever he wants. The Great Charter, the Magna Carta. Now, lastly, I'm just got to fly through this one. This is the Holy Roman Empire, which John Green always makes jokes that it wasn't holy, wasn't Roman, wasn't really an empire. So what happens is Otto the Great will be coronated as king of this region by the church, the Roman Catholic Church. Now there are tensions though. See, what happens is Otto the Great has a bunch of different regions like Bohemia, okay, and Burgundy, right, and Saxony. And these different regions have their own princes, and they all fight each other. They don't want Otto the Great nor the Roman Catholic Church calling the shots. This eventually comes to a head in the Vestiger controversy. So what happens is the Roman Catholic Church wanted to appoint bishops. But at the Concordant of Worms, Worms being a city, you see it on the map, they make a compromise where the Roman Catholic Church can appoint bishops, but the king has the right to veto. Now, why does that even matter? Basically, you got to look at it as this is an attempt by the governments to keep the church in check. I'm going to fly through this. We're Frederick the Redbeard, Barbarossa, he does fight in the Crusades. A little bit about the Vikings. You can watch it. So the Vikings, I guess you would say, start on land but make their claim to fame by sea. Though they are from Scandinavia and they are Nordic of heritage, what makes them famous is as they go around, attack different parts of Europe. And you'll see, though they attacked England hard, they also traded and attacked and spread their influences from Scandinavia down to the Byzantine. Because if the Vikings went and got booty, they would want to sell and trade that booty with places like Kiev and Rus and the Byzantine there to the right. So the Vikings were conquerors, but they never conquered for land. They conquered for booty. They grabbed and they ran typically. Technologically, they used long ships that allowed their boats to go up rivers, very shallow rivers, something that most boats couldn't do at the time. Now, some would say that the Vikings did help create modern countries, as modern countries had to unite to fight together against these Viking marauders. Now, the age of Vikings is interesting, and it goes on for hundreds of years. There's a crash course, second season, episode 224. You might want to watch if you want to learn just more about the Vikings. So these next slides you're just going to look over. The Roman Catholic Church was developing this entire time. People like Saint Benedict are given credit for helping create rules to the church and about how monasteries are supposed to behave and the roles of monks. You start to see that when we think of art, we often think maybe of cathedral, like Gothic cathedrals here at Notre Dame. The point being is, in terms of culture, they were the center of Europe. In terms of language, they were the ones with Latin. They were the ones with the Bible. In terms of religion, they were the ones that spread the word with any sort of authority. All right? lots of all rights today. Now, one thing that's really interesting is as the Roman Catholic Church is determined to continue its stronghold on power in Europe, it then decides to attack the expanding Umayyad and then eventually Abbasid empires and what you've heard of as the Crusades. Now, the Crusades cannot be spoken as one crusade because not only were there were attacks also on other Christians like the Byzantine, but the original one called for by Pope Urban II called for the different kings of England to send knights and men and boats and soldiers and money for a Deus Vult, God wills it, a jihad or a crusade to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims. So that was really the original goal, though there were times that the Crusaders bypassed that and just started attacking the Byzantine because of their money and power. This is similar to what happens in 1492, something called the Reconquista, which is the reconquering of Spain by the Christians, pushing the Muslims out of Al-Andalus. So I've tried today to do a little bit about England, France, Germany, and of course the church. The Crusades also has its own episode. Maybe that's the one you want to watch. The Crusades effects, I like this. The Byzantine is down because they were weakened by the Crusaders and even the Vikings. The Pope's authority is down because the Crusades are largely unsuccessful. Knights are down because, to be honest, sometimes knights plundered for themselves, their own booty. Now, regional kings' power was up as the Catholic Church's power is down. Religion is up, but more on a regional basis, trying to find faith through your locality, not the Catholic Church. Italy centralizes under military authority, and you start to see the rise of city-states, such as Venice, that are going to be very successful in trading. See, what happens is the whole Mediterranean becomes a hotbed of trade. Trade with the Muslims, not war. And of course, if you remember our video on the Abbasid, trade with the Islamic world meant contact with China's knowledge and India's knowledge. Then everything seems to fall apart. Through the trade that comes from the Mongols and East Asia and the Silk Road, you will see by 1347, the Black Death or the bubonic plague hits Constantinople. It then spreads to places like Naples, Venice, Florence, Genoa, a bunch of Italian city-states. And you could actually see how it just expands over time, where anywhere from 3 to 400 million will die because of the bubonic plague. This is pretty famous. It comes from what people would see on people with the plague and what you would do to people that died. So next time you grab hands and you sing Ring Around the Rosie, remember where it came from. Pockets full of posy. Hey, you want to smell better. You don't want to be sick and smell like death. The funny part is, when you take out so many people from Europe, you've cleaned house of competition. So there is more food to go around. Money and trade, because of the Crusades, is more beneficial to those in the regions. So you now almost see a rebirth going on in Europe. You see the Hanseatic League is a trade association, mostly of people up in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, England, with a trade association to make sure that they can trade down with Italians safely. Guilds start to emerge where you're not just living hand to mouth, you're actually developing what we used to have during the Roman era, like artisan class, merchant class. So what you see is by 1450 is a rebirth, which you might have heard as the Renaissance. So we eventually get to here by 13 to 1500 CE. That was, let me look, do I even have a time on this? That was probably about 20 minutes. If you want to stop and step away, I'm now going to move on to Eastern Europe, which is the Byzantine. All right, so now we are on to the Byzantine. The thing you don't know about the Byzantine is they were an empire for like 1,000 years. Now, at first, they were just the eastern part of the Roman Empire, but eventually they are their own entity with their own culture, their own belief system. This is the Hagia Sophia. It was once a Christian cathedral, which then became a Muslim mosque. You could see the minarets. This sits there in Constantinople. So take a second and look at this question. Which of the following was an important continuity in the history of the Mediterranean between 4 and 1000 CE? We're going to answer this by the end of today's lesson. So here's the Byzantine. The Byzantine were small in terms of just being the Eastern Roman Empire. Justinian tries his hardest to take back what was Rome in the Western European part, but that is very, very short-lived. But you can look at the Byzantine Empire as being more to the eastern part of the Mediterranean and part of North Africa. So one element of the Byzantine is that it's extremely regional. It has different geographies like the Balkan Peninsula, like the Eastern Mediterranean, like North Africa. And each of these are going to be different ethnic groups. And yes, each has its own different food, its different language, its different traditions and norms. So they speak Greek, they speak Latin, they even help create a language called Cyrillic. Later slide. Now, because of this, Constantinople always seems to be in a defensive posture by both its own regions and outsiders in the Islamic world. It eventually falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. A big reason why Unit 1 ends in 1450 because of the fall of Constantinople. In terms of religion was centralized in its political authority. So like Justinian, he had Hagia Sophia built, which is the Holy Wisdom, the House of Holy Wisdom. It is a massive cathedral. He practiced something called Caesaropapism. He was both Caesar and he was the papal or pope, which means I am the government, Caesar. I am the church, papal. You could understand when you bring those together, that is very theocratic. And you don't really see that power vested in the Western European world. Lots of pomp going on. You can just see their garb and how they dressed. Now, up in the top right, you see Cyril and Methodius. These are two missionaries who head north and to spread the Orthodox faith. And because of that, they have a hard time talking to people of Russia. So they eventually help the Slavs create a language called the Cyrillic language, the Cyrillic alphabet. So that's how powerful the Byzantine are. They basically give birth to the Slavic alphabet and language and move the Orthodox Church northward. Now, eventually, and I've mentioned this already, there is a great schism that happens in the church, and the Catholic Church excommunicates the Orthodox Church excommunicates the Catholic Church, and now we kind of see two Christian versions moving forward. In terms of centralization, it is extremely hard to centralize an empire. Constantinople was the hub. I will always use it like that. The hub. Trade coming from the Silk Road went there and to head out anywhere, and sometimes was duly taxed. Justinian was a centralizing figure. He built a larger empire shown in that map. He created something called Justinian's Code, which is kind of the writing down of Roman law. So going forward, Roman law, like the 12 tables, becomes Justinian's Code, which becomes English common law, which becomes America's laws. The Byzantine, though religious, do promote a secular education and a secular law. There is no Sharia that I'll be mentioning here. Very large bureaucracy. They do something called the system, where generals will be given large pieces of land called themes. The general will now run that theme and can portion it out as he will. So it sounds feudal, but all of these generals served the emperor. They weren't knights getting land. They were generals in the army getting land. And that is one way that the Byzantine was able to hold together. We did this, I swear, in class with my little red dots, right? So there's Justinian in the middle wearing purple, which means government. To his left, you see the Orthodox Church. To his right, you see both government officials and the military. This mosaic of Justinian shows Caesaropapism, total authority, something you don't see with Clovis or Otto the Great or William the Conqueror. Now, here's a visual that shows the hub that was Constantinople along the trade routes. Most of it in Europe and in Asia is the Silk Road, but there are trade routes to the Vikings up north in the North Sea. There are trade routes along the trans-Saharan trade routes over to Mali and Ghana. So this allowed Constantinople to have the money to pay for such opulence. Side note, when we start circumventing Africa into the Indian Ocean or circumventing the land routes to go to the Americas, Constantinople weakens. It needed to be the hub of trade and eventually gets bypassed by other trade routes over time. A little bit about economics. I think I already said this. You can just read this. I mean, yes, the Byzantine did tax, and of course, taxing helps create a bureaucracy and a government, but it also creates a bloated system where the cost of the theme system, the military defending Constantinople with its series of walls around it, at the end of the day was too much. And I would say that any bloated system, Han China, Roman, the United States, is challenged by their bureaucracy. Sometimes you get too big for your own government. In the end, the Byzantine spread Greek culture, keeps things Christian, has wealth, is diplomatic amongst its own different regions, and it has an organized administration. Its weaknesses is that its northern, southern, eastern, and western peripheries, the Catholics, the Kievan Rus, they're knocking on the door. The Crusaders chipping away at their land. I guess you would even say that they were arrogant. They did not want to play well with the West, and they will never reunite with the West. And this is maybe inappropriate for me to say. The Byzantine existed for over 1,000 years, but sadly, we don't remember them a lot for new things. They were the hub of ideas, but those ideas were coming and going through. The money was coming and going through, or the new ideas were Roman at one time and just passed on through them. So here's A, B, C, and D. I think the best answer probably is C. And of course, this is my last thing. If you want to study Russia, I'd encourage you to go watch Kievan Rus and on how the Byzantine helped create Russia and eventually how the Mongols helped create Russia. So that's a good long one. I hope you're all doing well. Be well.